Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Peppi Siddiq, and I work with IOM in our regional office in Bangkok, looking after issues on migrant protection assistance. So good morning for me and good afternoon for most of you there in Suva today. And welcome to this session on contemporary forms of slavery and labor rights. This session hopefully allows us to dive a little bit deeper into looking really at the legal and regulatory framework that exists out there, on which the states and private sector can lean on when they look at how to manage their labor supply chain issues. We'll also look a little bit about the obligations for private sector in this space, and then the very practical challenges that are still facing us out there. Just a second, I have some technical issues there. In the panel today, we should have 5 speakers representing all sides of the issue, and each one of the panelists will have about 10 minutes to introduce their points of view and the issue from the way that their organization views it. And then after that, we'll have about half an hour for an open floor, questions and answers, and a bit of debate amongst the panelists. But before we get there, I want to give a few thoughts from my side, framing the issue and how do we look at this. So first of all, starting off from thinking that contemporary forms of slavery is really, it's a fundamental violation of human rights. But at the same time, it also very prominently features in our globalized economy. It's not rare, it's something that's very present, almost any business that we look at. And it falls nicely within the scope of the guiding principles on business and human rights. Because really we're looking at a twofold responsibility of both the states and the business entities. They should recognize their obligations and responsibilities. And also there's a very strong need for remedies in this space, looking at the individual and their needs. There's quite a bit of terminology around this space, and then when talking about contemporary forms of slavery, we really mean a host of issues. We're talking about servitude, forced labor, debt bondage, worst forms of child labor, and deceptive recruiting for labor services. Often we interchange this term with human trafficking or just talking about modern slavery, and really the kind of 3 concepts can be used together. Of course, some of them have weightier legal obligations behind them, but particularly when talking on a forum like this, I find that it's okay to use the 3. There are really quite complex drivers behind modern slavery or human trafficking, but you have to look at the kind of factors behind what drives mobility, and it's often poverty or the need for physical safety and security. It's also lack of access to basics such as food, water, and healthcare. Migration patterns and displacement are a strong driver of also trafficking in humans. Climate change is a really emerging driver of this, and of course external shocks and crises such as COVID-19, which we anticipate is going to drive up the vulnerability of migrants and people on the move. And then there are also some cultural practices that are quite permissive to different forms of exploitation. Governments and businesses can still be taken by surprise by some of the practices that are found embedded in the supply chains. And this is really particularly challenging now, given the rapid industrial and economic change and the landscapes with jobs moving depending on pricing demands. And so regulatory frameworks really play a big role in trying to look at how do we ensure a level playing field here. Recently, there's been quite a lot of extra effort put into really driving the debate around modern slavery, and we see countries like the UK and Australia taking the lead in this space with enacting anti-modern slavery acts. And just a couple of days ago, yesterday even, maybe the Australian Border Force published the first tranche of modern slavery statements under their Modern Slavery Act. These statements should be really very interesting for us practitioners to study and to look at, in terms of how companies are addressing their modern slavery risks and how do they assess them. It's good to see where the private sector sees the gaps in, and what are the shared common practices or good practices. It's also important to understand that modern slavery is seen as a development issue, and it's made itself to the SDGs under Goal 8 and more famously the Target 8.7. So we're really looking at a world without forced labor, modern slavery, human trafficking, and child labor. And it's also here where we see plenty of evidence of distorted markets and unfair competition, where labor exploitation is not addressed, and businesses that struggle on the global market because of these type of practices. Good to keep in mind, though, that modern slavery is not a new issue. And as I mentioned, it's also, often referred to as human trafficking. And there's a strong body of conventions, declarations, and protocols already out there that address this issue. It's 2 decades now since the Palermo protocols were enacted, and many of the states here also are signatory to them, which is the first time really that there was a global agreement on how do we frame trafficking, and what are the steps that need to be taken to address that. ILO has also a raft of declarations and protocols that address issues around contemporary forms of slavery, and I'm sure the ILO panelists today will go into much more depth in this, but of course we have the fundamental principles and rights at work, which really focuses on the elimination of forced or compulsory labor. Despite all of the good work that has taken place already, whether it's the legal instruments, global or national, the regulatory approaches, modern slavery is by no means eradicated. And while it's notoriously difficult to have accurate data around human trafficking and exploitation in the workplace, Walk Free Foundation, and we have our panelists today as well, estimated in 2016 that there are still about 25 million men, women, and children in Asia and Pacific who are living in modern slavery-like conditions. In this region also, the majority of the trafficking and the modern slavery is found in forced labor. So forced labor and looking at supply chains is really a major issue for the region. Now, Pacific Island countries are, of course, a source, transit, and destination for local and Asian victims of trafficking. We see men recruited to work in logging and mining industries are subjected to forced labor. There are fishermen who have reported situations of labor trafficking. We have incidences of children in forced labor situations within the countries, often near foreign logging camps or foreign and local commercial fishing vessels who are perhaps recruiting labor force from elsewhere who are in very poor conditions. With this pressure on supply chain transparency, the states face the large and complex task of really now looking at putting measures in place to address and redress these serious crimes. And one of the big challenges still facing, particularly the Pacific, is the absence of effective policies to guide the monitoring and reporting of modern slavery. And in addition, of course, now the economic impacts of COVID-19 will have a significant increase in the risk of human trafficking, and we anticipate that some of these challenges will be really felt also in the Pacific. But so, having done that, I would like to hand the floor over to our first panelist, who is Lisa Singh, and she's the head of government advocacy for Australia and Pacific at the Walk Free Foundation, which is an international human rights organization working to end modern slavery globally. And of course, also, as I mentioned, a very good source for the little data that exists out there on the estimated numbers of people in modern slavery. She's also a former Australian senator who was instrumental in the policy development of Australia's Modern Slavery Act, as well as a former Tasmanian government minister for workplace relations. And perhaps most importantly, she also has familiar connections to Fiji, and her grandfather, Ramjati Singh, was a member of the Fiji parliament. So I'm going to hand over to Lisa, and I'm sure Lisa will tell us a little bit more about what her foundation sees going on in the Pacific, as well as the linkages to the Australian Modern Slavery Act. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Peppi, and welcome to everybody for this session, and to my other panelists who I'm looking forward to hearing from as well. I'm coming to you from Australia. I think it's great that this is a hybrid event where we can all participate to address these important issues of looking at contemporary forms of slavery and labour rights. I'm going to share today a little bit about Walk Free's research, recent research in the Pacific, and then also talk about the Australian Modern Slavery Act and its impact on the Pacific from what we know to date. So just to start that, I'm going to share my screen, which is here. So hopefully you can see that. And I just want to start by just to talk about some research that WORK3 published earlier this year called Murky Waters, which was a qualitative assessment of modern slavery in the Pacific region. It included a focus on 8 countries, 2 of which were also Australia and New Zealand, with 6 Pacific Island countries. And it provided a really comprehensive assessment of modern slavery in the region. The intention of the study was to draw together existing research on separate forms of modern slavery in the Pacific, such as, updating and building on, the existing knowledge base, with in-depth interviews on the ground from local sources, with an understanding of the issues in those countries. Of course, that included a range of forms of modern slavery that Peppi referred to earlier, from forced labour, forced sexual exploitation, commercial sexual exploitation of children, debt bondage, and the like. Some of the vulnerabilities that were identified through this study showed that, there are a number of drivers when it comes to modern slavery, including, links obviously between migration and modern slavery through the dislocation of social structures, social protections, displacement and forced migration. There was also sort of, the using of irregular migration channels. That all created a perfect storm of vulnerabilities that interact. For example, women's access to land and the impact of natural disasters such as climate change. Climate change obviously featured very strongly as well as part of that, as did poverty. And in fact, 1 in 4 Pacific Islanders live below their national poverty lines. So that is also a factor in terms of vulnerabilities. In terms of the gaps, the gaps in some of the responses from our research, I think what it showed is that there is actually a range of opportunities to strengthen responses to modern slavery in the Pacific, to address the factors that drive it, such as poverty, climate change, and violence against women. Some of the anti-slavery respondents in the Pacific region that were interviewed for this research identified these key gaps. Challenges of operating in a very resource-constrained context, for example, were raised in all the interviews that were the basis of this study, and identified as principal reasons for the existing gaps in the responses to modern slavery. And that, of course, largely reflects the fact that governments have limited resources and competing priorities that they have to face in the region. But overall, gaps were a lack of awareness of modern slavery, how to identify it, where to report it, the availability and access to modern slavery reporting mechanisms, across the region, where reporting mechanisms do exist in Pacific Island countries. They are often centralised telephone hotlines or websites that are not accessible in remote areas that have limited or even no telecommunication services. Other sort of gaps were monitoring and enforcement of existing laws, the sort of lack of or limited monitoring of legislation has been reported as a gap. And often this is where, legislation has been passed, the laws are not enforced, or at least they're not observed or put into practice. So that creates a sort of practical barrier to enforcement and monitoring in the Pacific as well. And then also sort of addressing some of the drivers of vulnerability, that the gaps exist in the provision of social protections and safety nets for vulnerable populations, including healthcare. And there is an ongoing lack of research as well. We do need to have a greater understanding of the nature and extent of modern slavery in Pacific Island countries, particularly in high-risk sectors. So what has occurred recently in our region, of course, is in the last couple of years, the Australian government has introduced the Modern Slavery Act. So this is, where obviously Walk Free with the ILO estimate that there are 40.3 million people globally living in conditions of modern slavery. So this act, its aim is to combat modern slavery in global supply chains. There is approximately 3,000 entities or organisations or businesses that covers that. That should be covered by this new piece of supply chain transparency legislation. And they include foreign businesses that also must report if they carry on business in Australia at any time, and also meet the threshold, which is a annual consolidated revenue of 100 million Australian dollars. There is a lot of criteria, 7 sort of distinct criteria that businesses or entities need to report under, and much of that criteria has been established in the legislation based on the UN guiding principles for business and human rights. So this is where the Australian Act is of a higher quality in a sense than the UK Act. Obviously, it's learnt from the UK Act, but it's come afterwards, and it has used those UN guiding principles as a real factor in the drafting of this legislation. So statements are submitted to government and published on an online register. I just want to move to that. This online register, as Peppi alluded to, the government has just last Friday published the first 121 modern slavery statements from entities that they include foreign entities, Australian entities and the like, which is publicly available. And again, this is what makes the Australian Act a really good piece of legislation, because anyone can go onto this website and actually look up companies, do a search. The search function is very good as well, to look at the statements of some of these corporations and how they are addressing modern slavery in their supply chains and meeting those 7 criteria that I referred to earlier. I think the main thing, though, about the Australian Modern Slavery Act is it's raised awareness of modern slavery among Australian businesses, a number of which have supply chains and even direct operations in the Pacific that they now obviously need to address. And this could be Australian supermarkets stocking Pacific seafood, commercial seafood companies, Australian shipping or logistic companies delivering to the Pacific, or employing Pacific workers as sailors or on container vessels. Another big one is the global companies operating in the tourism sector, hotel sector, many of which are caught in this Australian Act. And I think many big IT companies, car companies reporting under the Act also have dealerships in the Pacific as part of their operations as well. So Australian companies, will be asking their suppliers to ensure there is no forced labour in their supply chains, putting in place policies, self-questionnaires, contracts with forced labour clauses, conducting audits. That's all a part of the criteria that they need to address. And the same applies to Australian investors, by the way, in that sense. But ultimately, this is increasing market pressure, reputational risk, and regulation that means companies will have to take action. I think it's a bit early to see how the Act is concretely impacting in the Pacific, but the imminent publication, I think, of this first tranche of the modern slavery statements will provide a good indication of what companies are doing in this area. As I said, one of the differences between this Act and the UK Act is the fact that it has a real focus on the UN Guiding Principles for Human Rights. And I think we will be at WORK3 assessing these modern slavery statements. So I think it is good for companies, Pacific Island companies, to get ahead of the curve by putting these sorts of policies and procedures in place. Just finally, I know I'm running out of time, so I just wanted to quickly share that the Bali Process Government and Business Forum is a platform that Pacific Island countries and the region can engage on business and human rights issues. WORK3 acts as the secretariat of the Bali Process Government and Business Forum. It does include Pacific Island countries, 45 countries in total, and some UN agencies. It's the first of its kind in the Indo-Pacific region. And I think it's a really positive step in the collaboration between government and business in the need to end these heinous crimes. And it has become a permanent track of the Bali Process Ministerial Conference as well. It has AAA recommendations that address supply chain transparency and look at strengthening responses to modern slavery in our region. So for more information on that, you can certainly go to the Bali Process Government and Business Forum website. And for even more information, you can go to walkfree.org, where we have a number of publications, information, and also links to the Global Slavery Index, which obviously provides an even further breakdown on government responses to modern slavery, and also the reports of modern slavery in the Pacific Island region. Thank you, Peppi.
Thank you, Lisa. And I'm also happy to give a plug for the Bali Process Business and Government Forum. It organizes really well targeted and thought out events, and so really I think adds value to this debate. But Lisa, thank you for your remarks. It's good to look at some of those drivers and structural issues further if we have time. And on the statements from the Australian Modern Slavery Act, I mean, I'm really looking forward to also seeing what WORK3 makes of them. We had a quick look yesterday from IOM side, and it seems that there's quite a wide variance between, you know, what the statements say and, you know, to what level of detail they go, and also would be interesting to go and kind of look at the accountability behind that and how do we move towards the next step. But let me introduce the next speaker. We have Elena Guerra Simova from ILO, and she's the Decent Work and International Labour Standards Specialist with ILO in the Office of Pacific Island Countries in Fiji. Prior joining to the ILO, she has a very long and distinguished career in law and labor rights. She is a co-founder and has worked for more than 15 years as the director of the Center for Social and Labor Rights, leading Russian non-governmental organization in this space. She's also the co-founder and has been the chair of the Russian National Professional Association Lawyers for Labor Rights for over 17 years. And Ms. Gerasimova will be telling us a little bit more about the ILO conventions and how those specifically impact the Pacific region, and, you know, how private sector can lean more on the direction and guidance coming from there. So Elena, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Peppi, and hello everyone. Thanks for inviting us to present at this forum. And can I ask to share the presentation? Yeah, great, thank you. Next slide, please. Can I have next slide? Thanks. So ILO is one of the UN agencies. It's a specialized agency which was established long before the United Nations in 1919, and since 1946 it's a part of the UN system. And today we have 187 members, including 11 member states in the Pacific. Next slide, please. ILO promotes decent work agenda through achieving 4 strategic objectives. They include fundamental principles and rights at work, employment, social protection, and social dialogue. And further, I'm going to stop a bit in more details on fundamental principles and rights at work. Next slide. There are 8 so-called core or fundamental conventions, which cover the most important fundamental principles and rights in the sphere of work. They were recognized as such by the Declaration of 1998. And these fundamental principles include freedom of association, elimination of all forms of forced or compulsory labor, effective abolition of child labor, and elimination of discrimination in respect of employment and occupation. The content of these principles and rights is presented in 8 fundamental declarations, and we are gonna stop in more details on some of these instruments, particularly on those which explain the content of principles on elimination of forced or compulsory labor. This includes Conventions 29, Convention 105, and Protocol 29, and effective abolition of child labor on one of these conventions, Convention 182. Next slide, please. When we speak about modern slavery, we use a term which is not really covered in international conventions, ILO conventions at least, and we use the term forced labor. So forced labor was first prohibited by Convention of 1930, Convention number 29, and by today it has 178 ratifications from 187 members, so it's just 9 countries left to ratify this convention to achieve universal ratification. So under forced labor, we understand all forms of work or services that is exacted from any person under menace of penalty and for which the said person has not offered him or herself voluntary. So this is quite a broad definition, and it is based on the nature of the relationship between the person and an employer, not on the legal criteria of the relationship. Next slide, please. The same convention defines 5 limited exceptions to the forced labor, those situations which are not considered to be forced labor, and they include work under compulsory military service, normal civic obligations of a fully self-governing countries, prison labor as a consequence of conviction in a court of law, provided and carried out under the supervision and control of the public authority, work exacted in case of emergency such as war, calamity, and threatened calamity. And the last case is minor communal services performed by the members of a community in a direct interest of this community. Next slide, please. So the forced labor can appear at various stages of employment labor relationship. It may start during the recruitment, during the implementation of job obligations, and when leaving the employer. And as forms of the forced labor, we consider those which are imposed by the state and those which are imposed by private economies. And those imposed by private economies include sexual exploitation and labor, various forms of labor exploitation. Next slide, please. The next convention on forced labor is Convention of 1957, Convention number 102 on abolition of forced labor. And for today, it has 176 ratification. Again, we expect 11 more ratifications from ILO member states to achieve universal ratification. And this convention is a supplementary to Convention 29, which was just presented. And it establishes a strict prohibition of forced labor in 5 specific circumstances. First is as a means of political coercion or education, or as a punishment for holding or expressing views ideologically opposed to the established political, social, and economic system. Well, actually, I should mention that this is quite serious concern in many countries, including countries in the Pacific, this particular form of forced labor. Also, forced labor is strictly prohibited as a method of mobilizing and using labor for purposes of economic development. And as I'll show you further some statistical and estimates data, we'll see that this is also used quite often and quite widely in different countries. It is prohibited to use as a means of labor discipline, as a punishment for participation in a strike, and as a means of racial, social, national, or religious discrimination. Next slide, please. The third convention which I want to mention is the Worst Forms of Child Labor Convention. It is the latest from these 8 fundamental conventions. It is Convention 182, and this is the first and the only convention among ILO conventions which achieved universal ratifications. It happened just this year. The last country which ratified this convention was Tonga. And actually, a few countries which ratified this convention within the last few years were from the Pacific region. So our region really invested into achieving the universal ratification of this convention. And in accordance with this convention, each member state should provide immediate and effective measures to secure the prohibition and elimination of worst forms of child labor as a matter of urgency. And among worst forms of child labor, we find forms which are very closely related to forced labor, particularly all forms of slavery or practices similar to slavery, such as sale and trafficking of children, debt bondage and serfdom, forced or compulsory labor, including forced or compulsory recruitment of children for use in armed conflicts. Next slide, please. And the latest document which I want to mention today is the protocol of 2014 to the Forced Labor Convention. It received, so it is the most recent document, and for today it received 47 ratifications, which is quite a lot within 6 years. And the recommendation 2003, which is accompanying this protocol. So this protocol is a supplementary document to the Forced Labor Conventions 29 and 105, and it brings ILO standards against forced labor into the modern era by accounting for changes in the context and forms of forced labor in the contemporary economy. This protocol particularly recognizes modern forms of trafficking for forced labor, including sexual commercial exploitation, and recognizes the increased number of workers who are in forced labor in the private economy, recognizes that there are some groups of people who are at high risk of becoming victims of forced labor, especially those people who migrate, usually not really voluntary. Next slide, please. And please, next slide. Oh, no, sorry, the one before. Yeah, thank you. And this protocol also constitutes a number of measures addressing causes of forced labor and ensures the full respect for human rights of the offended people. So it establishes the obligation of all countries to prevent forced labor, protect those subjected to forced labor, and to provide them with access to full and sufficient remedies. Next slide. And yeah, skip this. Next one. Thanks. So this is the information about ratification of these conventions in the Pacific region. So as I mentioned, we were looking at particular instruments on forced labor and child labor. So you can see that among ILO member states in the Pacific, there are 7 countries which ratified Convention 29 and Convention 105 on forced labor, and all Pacific, as all other ILO members, have ratified Convention 182 on worst forms of child labor. By now, there are no any countries which have ratified Protocol 29. Right now, there is one country which is considering ratification of Protocol 29 in the nearest future. And this country is Fiji, and I hope my colleague Atish probably may mention this during his presentation. Next slide, please. I also want very quickly to stop on a few other instruments. When I mentioned fundamental conventions, I also mentioned that one of the fundamental principles and rights at work is freedom of association. Freedom of association is quite important and critical for promotion and protection of all other rights, and it is considered among the most fundamental in all countries. Why? Because it provides an opportunity to organize trade unions for workers organizations, and having a union achieve positive and sustainable measures in improvement of working conditions for people, including elimination of worst forms of child labor, worst forms of forced labor, and generally forced labor. So this is quite an important issue and convention to implement. This convention is also ratified by 6 countries in our region, including Fiji, but still some countries have issues with implementation of this convention. Yeah, there are numerous issues raised by the ILO supervisory bodies, and we still need to progress a lot to achieve full implementation of this convention in the region. Next slide, please. I also want to mention one of the recent conventions, which was adopted last year, Convention on Violence and Harassment in the World of Work. It's a convention number 190. This is quite new and recent instrument, which is addressing issues of violence and harassment, which often accompany forced labor. And I also want to emphasize today, and I think we are all very proud that Fiji has ratified this convention. There are only 2 countries which ratified this convention by today, and Fiji was the 2nd country with ratification coming earlier next year. Next slide, please. Earlier this year, sorry. Now I want to share some information about the situation with forced labor and modern slavery. You see some covers of the reports which were released by law, and some of these reports were released together with other organizations. Particularly, you can see the report of 2012, Global Estimates on Forced Labor, and the last publication on the right, Global Estimates of Modern Slavery. It was produced as a part of the Alliance 8.7 work, and it was delivered together with Work Free by ILO together with Work Free. So it was a joint report released in 2016. Next slide, please. I also want to say a few words about Alliance 8.7. What is that? You know that among SDGs, SDG 8 has target 8.7. The purpose of target 8.7 is to eradicate forced labor, modern slavery, and human trafficking, and to secure the prohibition and elimination of the worst forms of child labor, including recruitment and use of child soldiers, and by 2025 to end the child labor in all its forms. Fiji is one of the Alliance 8.7 Pathfinders countries with very active position in promotion, elimination of child labor. And again, I'm sure that Atish will stop on this in more details. Next slide, please. So this is the data from the Global Estimates on Modern Slavery of report of 2016. As per this report, today we count around 40 million people as victims of modern slavery, and this includes 25 million people in forced labor. Other 15 million are people in forced marriages, and around 152 million children as victims of in child labor. Of course, the situation may be much worse now because of the COVID-19 pandemic, because it negatively impacted all spheres of working relationships, including our situation with forced labor and modern slavery and child labor. But unfortunately, it is very difficult to get more or less exact data on this, and there were no reports or estimations released yet. Next slide, please. Yeah, here, this is just the brief information about the people in modern slavery based on sex. So you can see that majority of people in modern slavery, in different forms of modern slavery, are women, especially, of course, in forced sexual exploitation, but even average involvement in modern slavery, women constitute around 71% of those involved in modern slavery. Next slide.
Can I also just, sorry, Elena, because we still have a few more panelists as well, if we can slowly start wrapping up, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, 2 minutes more. So if you look at the age of people involved in modern slavery, you again can find that around 25% of those involved in modern slavery are children, generally. And next slide, please. And this is information about regional situation. In Asia and Pacific, we have we don't have a separate data on Pacific. This is always the difficult part of all these estimations and research, but based on the global regional picture, global world and regional picture, the situation in Asia and Pacific is probably the most complicated. We have around 4 people, more than in other countries, in modern slavery as average. And next slide, please. And if you look at the share, around 62% of people in modern slavery are in Asia and Pacific. And can we go to the very last slide? Next. Yeah, here. Please stop here. So from the point of, if we look at the use of the forced labor and modern slavery, especially forced labor from the point of view of purposes, we found that almost 63%, more than 63% of those involved in modern slavery are people involved for purposes of economic development. So just to conclude this information and this presentation, we see that a lot of situations when the modern slavery and forced labor is used, including in this region, is for economic purposes, and de facto we can change this situation by political measures and by joint actions of governments, international organizations, and civil society organizations. And hopefully the fact that Fiji is a pacified country, which purpose is also to demonstrate really a path, good example to work to eliminate forced labor and child labor. We have a very strong hope that this will help to change and improve the situation in the Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elena, for a very comprehensive take on the legal and regulatory framework that governs this space and states can lean on. As you mentioned, though, there are always issues around implementation, and you specifically kind of drew our attention to the freedom of association. But if we do get some time following the panelist interventions, would be great to explore that space a little bit more, look at partnerships and what can we do more concretely to to support the implementation and see that these issues move forward. But let me introduce the next panelist. We are now moving on to the private sector side, and it's going to be Rigamoto Taito, who is just a second. He has over 20 years of experience covering banking, manufacturing, telecommunications, tourism, and a very strong understanding of business in Fiji and the region. His current role as Director General Manager of Evergreen International Fiji, which is responsible for one of the largest labor forces in Fiji with over 1,000 staff. And he's also part of forming the Anti-Modern Slavery Subcommittee under Fiji Commerce and Employers Federation, the FCEF, in an attempt to bring more awareness on modern slavery and worker exploitation in reference to what has been implemented in Australia. So Riga will take us a little bit more into the tangible space now in the Pacific and in Fiji, looking at specifically the challenges that the private sector is facing in this area, and what are they doing and where could they use a little bit more help from other partners as well. So the floor is yours, Riga.
Oh, thank you, Peppi. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm here representing the Fiji Commerce Employer Federation. It has about 270 members, covering around about 30,000 workers in Fiji. That roughly makes up about close to 30% of Fiji's workforce. As Peppi mentioned, we have recently set up a steering committee on modern slavery, but also, and just as important, on the other degrees of labor exploitation, which we are starting to see more and more in the marketplace. A key thing that we are aiming to do initially, and in collaboration with the Ministry of Employment, hopefully the ILO, which I'm sure will happen after this forum, and PIPSO, is to create awareness on what modern slavery is. I think it's important because outside of this forum, many don't have a good idea of what modern slavery is. The other thing is the degree of labor exploitation that's been practiced in the market. And that is becoming more of an issue from the businesses we operate in, from the industries we work in terms of more and more companies taking advantage of the situation, especially with COVID, to engage more in exploitation of workers. And we're talking working long hours, making their workers work long hours, not paying them their full entitlements, and also making them work in unsafe conditions. We also recently, with FCEF, embedded the modern slavery agenda as part of the HR council within FCEF. FCEF has 9 councils representing a broad spectrum of business in Fiji. So this has now recently been embedded in the HR council. We also want to leverage more of the tripartite forum between FCEF, the Ministry of Economy, and the Fiji trade unions. This has already been set up and guided by the ILO in terms of ensuring Fiji's ERIP is practiced, and also to look after the workers and promote social protection as supported again by ILO. On top of that, we do have members in our steering committee, and these are companies, representatives of companies like Acelio Care, ANZ Bank, and Coca-Cola, who have to some degree established or set up a anti-modern slavery practices within how they work within the supply chain as part of the Australian Modern Slavery Act. And some of these companies in Fiji have already put certain clauses into contracts with suppliers that, as much as possible, get suppliers to state that they are not practicing any forms of modern slavery or labor exploitation. So these are some of the learnings that we want to draw from as we create awareness and as we look to how we can address the issues of modern slavery and other forms of labor exploitation. Firstly, within members of FCEF, and hopefully using that to spread out to the other areas, including the Pacific. We've also partnered with PIPSO And through that connection, we're trying to use whatever learnings we have in Fiji to apply across the Pacific. So I also think it's important that I talk about some cases of modern slavery and exploitation in the workforce. Of course, I'm going to be using Fiji as an example. Murky waters, you heard from Lisa. I've read the article and I think it provides a strong insight into examples of modern slavery practices. And she makes good reference to children and women in the sex trade, along with examples in the fishing industry. Recently in Fiji, we've seen an increase in child labor. I think it's fair to say it could be an effect of what's happening with COVID. Additionally, like I mentioned before, we've seen more businesses taking advantage of the situation to indulge more in labor exploitation practices. Now, one of the reasons why businesses do engage in labor exploitation is obviously to save on their labor costs. Even if they are paying their labor, as per ERP, there are other regulatory payments and requirements that can also add to up to another 25 to 30% on top of normal payroll. That is quite a cost if you are competing in terms of providing services and goods in a competitive market. So the danger is, as these companies continue, or as they are able to get away with it more and more, it puts a big burden on those companies that are looking after their workers, that are following Fiji's labor laws, that are doing the right thing in terms of meeting the necessary costs to ensure that their workers are protected. Because quite frankly, they've been undercut in the market. Customers now are more price sensitive than ever. So when they look at the supply chain, price is now a big motivator. And there's a big tendency now to go towards a cheaper provider. Unfortunately, in most cases, in some industries, that cheaper price comes with a negative undercurrent, and that's off the back of the poor worker that's been exploited. So not only is it important that we educate our fellow members fellow business members in FSF, but we need to educate the market, the customers, especially in terms of understanding modern slavery and how it impacts the supply chain. The issue of bringing awareness of companies who do engage in practices of modern slavery and labor exploitation is a difficult one. Firstly, workers that are being exploited in most cases are afraid to speak up in fear of losing employment. In some cases, they may not be aware that they've been exploited. Some industries, like the security industry, for example, in Fiji, over 90%, and Atish can testify to this, we've been working very closely together in trying to address this. Over 90% of the companies that operate in the security industry are practicing in some forms of labor exploitation. So, having said that, we are, through creating awareness, through forming partnerships, we are trying to, firstly, set up a strong forum that can capture not just the reporting of companies that are indulging in modern slavery or labor exploitation, but to set up forums where workers can come and raise their grievances without fear of victimization. Atish will also talk about some of the initiatives the Ministry of Employment has set up, including a whistleblower policy, which is definitely a step in the right direction. And that is also a part that we like to link in with FSF, and also getting feedback from within our members of any knowledge of other companies or workers that may be exposed to, again, modern slavery or labor exploitation. In terms of moving forward, education around not only the awareness aspect of it, but how do customers, when selecting who to partner with in their supply chain, how do they go about screening potential suppliers to ensure that they are not in any forms of practicing modern slavery or labor exploitation. And this obviously involves getting information on suppliers, setting up a database similar to what Lisa spoke about in Australia, and in terms of where companies can go to vet suppliers in terms of their practices, or in terms of if there have been cases or issues that have been put up against them. And again, this is something that initially we have discussed with the Ministry of Labor. And again, something we're working very closely with them in setting up a database that companies can refer to when screening potential suppliers. It is also important that we work a lot closer, and I know I've mentioned the Ministry of Labor, I've mentioned ILO, but I also think it's important the Fiji trade unions play a key part in this. I'm hoping there's representatives from the Fiji trade unions in this forum. I think more than ever, their presence or their involvement is critical. And in partnership with FSF and the Ministry of Employment, using the tripartite forum, we can get more feedback, more information in terms of from workers and from other companies to get a better idea of the degree of modern slavery and labor exploitation in the marketplace. I think it's important to also mention, while we need to look after workers' rights, from a foreign investor point of view, Fiji needs to portray that we have a strong regulated market. I represent an international company, and I get asked a lot, especially now, why should we invest in Fiji? Why should we continue to invest in Fiji when we are being disadvantaged by non-compliant operators? And I'm sure the same can be asked of and said by a lot of other international companies in Fiji right now. So it's not only important to safeguard and protect workers' rights, but for the sake of the economy and moving forward and getting foreign companies to invest more, we need to demonstrate that we have a credible, strong, regulated platform with regards to workers. And it's also important that we start, and this has to, I would hope, start as a priority in getting the awareness out. Not just within our own forums, but out into the general public, out to the workers, so they understand their situation a lot better. They understand the channels as to which they can raise their grievances a lot better. And also from other companies when screening potential suppliers to partner with in their supply chain, they understand what to look for and how to report cases of modern slavery or labor exploitation to ensure that these get raised and these get actioned on. So that, in summing up, I think what we're looking for today from FSF is strong collaboration with other partners, with the Ministry of Economy, and I must acknowledge the Ministry of Economy and Atish. He's been very instrumental in working with us. We have already raised a few cases with Atish through collaboration with some of the other members in FSEF who have raised some cases of exploitation and modern slavery. And credit to Atish and the Ministry of Economy, they have acted on it. So it's a problem that's too big for the Ministry of Economy, sorry, of Labor, as the regulator to manage on their own. And they need all the support and assistance in a collaborative manner from FSEF and from other stakeholders as we address this problem together. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Riga, for taking us to the really tangible issues and kind of to where the meat of the matter is, really looking at businesses and recruitment practices and employers, unions, and how do we ensure that a lot of these conventions that we have mentioned and the global regulatory frameworks are understood and applied in practice on the ground. And really kind of you raised the very important role of the regulator in creating an even playing field for the companies so that you can compete on an equal basis and have the same overheads in terms of looking after your labor and how important that is. And then that's really important across industries. And I think that's something that's come up also a lot when we look at the fishing sector. And we're very happy, very pleased to have also a representative from the government or from the regulator here today. So Mr. Atish Kumar will be our next speaker, and he has 20 years experience in public service. He is the acting deputy secretary at the Fijian Ministry of Employment, Productivity and Industrial Relations, as well as the director of labor standard services in Fiji, looking after the compliance and enforcement of labor laws in Fiji. So he should really be able to take us a little bit into the direction of what is the regulator doing and where are the challenges that they're facing in terms of ensuring this level playing field that we need both for the companies to thrive and to ensure that there's no exploitation in the supply chain. So Atish, the floor is yours.
Thank you, moderator, fellow panelists, participants. Yes, indeed, it is a pleasure for me to be here this afternoon to actually present in terms of the point of view for a regulator in terms of what we are doing in the area of modern slavery and how we are going to ensure that we have this embedded in our law. So in terms of the Employment Relations Act, the Fijian government has actually ratified ILO Convention 29 and forced labor convention. I believe my colleague Elena has actually covered on this. Now, this convention has actually been embedded into the Employment Relations Act that came into effect on the 2nd of April 2008. And we also have established the provisions of labor inspection within the Act. So that actually the inspectors go out in the field and actually conduct labor inspections to ensure that employees and workers are aware of their rights, their responsibilities, what they're supposed to do. We also have ratified ILO Convention 87 on freedom of association and protection of rights to organize, Convention 98 on right to organize and collective bargaining, and this is where the workers have the right to form and join trade union of their choice. The employees also have the right to form and, of course, join the organizations of their choice and work together in terms of the ILO Convention 144 on tripartite consultation. I believe my colleague, Mr. Rigamoto, has actually emphasized on this, on the tripartite conventions and how best we can work together to resolve this problem and ensure that workers are given the rights and the labor rights and ensure that they are paid their rightful wages and dues. Now, when you look at the Fijian Constitution, Section 33, it talks about the right in terms of just minimum wage and the right to work, and that actually complements with the Employment Relations Act coming into effect. We have noted and seen that we have got a robust labor relation process, we have got a robust labor inspection process that actually ensures that any form of slavery or any form of exploitation is reported to the ministry. We also have launched in 2018 a toll-free number 1535 where workers can actually call in and lodge a complaint. They can also seek advice and information in terms of their employments. They can also report a matter to the ministry for investigation. And with that in place, the ministry, of course, the Fijian government has also ratified ILO Convention 182 on worst forms of child labor. and 138 on minimum age. We have in fact worked very closely with the ILO, and we're actually working very closely with ILO and also our tripartite partners to ensure that the issues in terms of child labor, issues in terms of forced labor is actually addressed at the workplace level. With that in place, the Fijian government is the second country. Of course, we are the second country in the world to ratify Convention 190, that is violence and harassment at workplace. So we have actually embedded this within the process, within the operations plans within the ministry, and also in terms of the labor inspection process. And with that in place, we have noted that the labor inspection process has been modernized. We are actually going into a step further in ensuring that inspectors are given the responsibility on reporting of cases. We also have an employer education program that we are running very closely with FSEF to ensure that the employers are actually advised on their responsibilities. We also working closely with the trade unions to ensure that the workers' rights are actually the workers know their rights and responsibilities, what they're supposed to do, and we also have a reporting mechanism. So any worker in Fiji, in terms of their grievances and in terms of the issues on employment relations, they have the right to lodge their grievances to the Ministry of Employment. And of course, the grievances are then heard through the mediation services, through the compliance services. The compliance services of the ministry also works very closely to ensure that if workers are not paid their dues, and the workers are not forced into any form of employment or not paid their rightful wages, then of course they lodge complaint to the ministry, and of course we take it through a normal process. And if the employer has actually not paid the rightful dues, then of course the adjudication process, the court process kicks in. So these are the processes that we have, and of course workers don't pay. This is a free of charge service to the workers. And also we advise the employers, we assist in terms of formulating of employment contract. We assist to ensure that no employer forces a worker. In the area of child labor, we can note that we have worked very closely under the Tackle project with the European Union to ensure that our stakeholders are aware of the issues. Our stakeholders are actually working closely to ensure that we say no to child labor and yes to education. And I know that, of course, our government has very closely worked to ensure that we provide the rightful assistance to our children so that they are in school. And of course, we are proud of that achievement. We continue to provide them with free education to ensure that these children are in school. And we had also noted that through FSF that, of course, there are areas that we will work together to ensure that due to this COVID period, if there is any child that needs assistance, we are there to assist them and ensure that they are actually in school. Just last 2 weeks, we have launched with the Ministry of Women and Children the interagency guideline on child protection, and we are very closely working with Ministry of Women and Children to ensure that the interagencies come together. The government department, non-government organizations, they come together, the employers and workers, we come together to actually assist and form committees, district committees, and we assist in terms of ensuring that we prevent child labor. And we also have a reporting mechanism in place. If there is any case of child labor, then of course the reporting mechanism is there. So in terms of the areas of labor inspection, we have got a robust labor inspection system. We also have the reporting mechanism in place where employers and workers can come in and discuss areas of improvement in terms of employment contract, in terms of their collective agreements, in terms of ensuring that if there is any complaint, how best they can deal. We also encourage employees and workers to work together, and of course, good faith process is very, very important. So all in all, the Ministry of Employment is working very closely with the tripartite partners to ensure that we come together as a team, and we say no to modern slavery, and we might ensure that our laws are there to protect workers and also employers. That's briefly in terms of my presentation for these areas of modern slavery and labor rights.
Thank you very much, Atish, for talking about the issues from the regulator's point of view and highlighting and outlining all the very good work that the Fijian government is already doing in this space. We're running a little bit behind schedule. I was hoping to have about half an hour for Q&A, but I think we have about 15 minutes now, so I'm going to move into the questions now. There's been some questions posted in the chat function, and so I can start with those, and then there will also be an opportunity, I think, for people actually present in Suva to ask questions from the floor. But let me just have a quick look at the questions that have been posted. I think one of the first ones that I would like to ask, and sorry, this is a bit cheeky, but this is one of mine. But having had the emphasis on the freedom of association mentioned a few times, both by the business side and ILO and the Convention 87, how would the ratification and application of that particular convention, so the freedom of association, allow us to, or allow the Pacific Islands to work more in the space of eliminating modern slavery in the supply chains? I would really like to hear the points of view on that from the panelists first. And this one, I think you can just, whoever wants to go first can grab the question and go.
Thank you very much for this question, Peppi. Well, actually, first I want to emphasize that Convention 87 on freedom of association has been ratified by 6 countries from the Pacific, Singhs among 7. And the same situation with Convention 98 on collective bargaining. Also 6 countries from 11 have ratified this convention. Both these 2 conventions, they guarantee the right to organize workers and employers organizations in full freedom without their interference from each other and from the state, and to bargain collectively to improve working conditions of workers. So this de facto, this convention is the guarantee of organizing workers' organization in formal and in informal economy. And we are discussing partnerships, how to work jointly between different organizations, UN agencies, national governmental agencies, and non-governmental agencies, how to work together. But in sphere of labor relations, the most effective way to come to each worker and to help workers to improve their working conditions and to eliminate modern slavery, forced labor, is through workers' organizations. Because as we discussed earlier today, very often workers do not know themselves that they're exploited. Sometimes they do not know about grievance procedures. Sometimes they're just afraid to raise their voice because they're afraid to lose jobs. So it is very often very complicated for workers individually to change the situation, including the situation of modern slavery, of forced labor. So organized labor through workers' organizations, through trade unions, working together through social dialogue with governments, with employers and employers association, can raise those issues and can raise problems of particular workers and help to improve the situation. That's why the right for freedom of association is very critical to improve working conditions of workers in all countries, wherever in the world, both informal and an informal economy. Usually earlier, this right was recognized only for formal employment relationship, but now more and more working places move to informal economy. So it is very important also to organize workers in informal economy to guarantee this at the national level and to support establishing and development of trade unions also in informal economy. And this.
Thank you. Would it also be something that we could have maybe the private sector, Riga, or from Atish, the regulator's point of view, to add to that?
So I think it's very important for us to understand in terms of the areas of the convention and how it operates in terms of the legislation in place. Of course, every worker has a right to form and join trade union, and of course, their right to collective bargaining, their right to be a member, and of course, they have the right to vote in a trade union election. Now, that is in place in terms of ensuring that we come together. The trade unions and of course the employers will then work together in terms of the contemporary rights of these workers on the minimum terms and conditions and how best they can bargain. This is an area that the trade union, of course, the Employment Relations Act is very clear in that, the right to bargain, and of course, working together with the trade unions is also very, very important. And of course, I believe the employees and the unions have been working together in these areas.
Just to add from a private sector perspective, so like I mentioned through FSEF in terms of creating awareness on modern slavery and labor exploitation, that agenda has also been embedded in the HR Council as part of FSEF. So from an employee perspective, the aim is to create more awareness on these issues with the respective HR representatives from the different companies in FSEF. So then they themselves are then encouraged to have a better open conversation with their own employees. But the other thing, I think it's the unions, like I mentioned, they have a big part of it. As an employer, we fully support freedom of association in terms of raising grievances. So I think it's apart from using the quite a bit of the existing channels and also the open toll-free lines that Atish has set up. I think it's also important that the employers themselves, with a better understanding of what's involved in modern slavery, also address that within their respective through their HR department with their employees directly.
Thank you. Lisa, do you want to step on this one or should we move on to the next?
I think it's fine to move on, Peppi.
Okay, great. I've just been told by the organizers that we can go a little bit over time, and there was supposed to be a fifth panelist representing the Fijian NGO civil society organizations. And I've heard that there's someone in the room present who would be ready to read a short statement on behalf of the fifth panelist. So if Vilsoni, you are there, please, you could read the statement now.
Thank you, Madam Moderator and the panelists and participants here in Suva and joining us online. Very quickly, I will read from Dr. Patricia Kailoa, who's supposed to present. She's won't be in front here, but if you would like to dialogue further about the narrative, you could meet her outside. I'm sure there's no harm dialoguing with her in regards to the narrative over a cup of tea or a glass of juice. So here we go. Dr. Patricia Kailola is Australian, yet she has lived and worked in several Pacific and Southeast Asian nations over the past 50 years. Patricia's basic profession is proudly fisheries, science, and management, yet she's also a human rights advocate, notably on human trafficking. Patricia is a visiting research fellow at the Institute of Applied Science at USP. Her purpose in the past half-dozen years has been to raise awareness on the abuse of men who work as crew in the Pacific tuna fishery and encourage their emancipation. While listening carefully to the plenary presentations yesterday, she has made notes to support this presentation today, such as respect for people, businesses to recognize the harms they do and then remedy them. How do we create incentives for businesses to do better? The need to consult and the importance of Talanoa. Someone also said that the national action plans help to make changes and that interaction between industry associations, trade unions, international organizations, and academics together produce better work ethics. Take the Fiji tuna fishery as an example, where none of these things are happening. But she added that understand the other side. Their constraints, their objectives are important also. It's no good for CSOs going like a bull at a bush at a company if the CSO doesn't appreciate the constraints and objectives of that company. There are 18 Fiji fishing companies, of which 4 have quite several vessels, and most have one or few, totaling about 60 fishing vessels. These companies mainly fish within the 200 NMEEZ, and export fresh chilled tuna to Australia, New Zealand, US, Japan, at least when planes are flying. In addition to those vessels, numerous foreign vessels come to Fiji ports to offload, take on supplies, and local and foreign crew. This latter suite of vessels mainly fish on the high seas beyond national jurisdictions. The Fiji companies compete against the foreign vessels, which are subsidized by their governments. PEFCO and other processes here also compete because Asian workers' salaries are much lower than the Fijian workers' salaries. And always there is the competition for tuna, a resource which gets smaller each year. There are extremely high fixed costs in running fishing vessels: bank mortgages, engines, food, and fuel, and water, and bait, port fees, etc. So in attempts to balance them, variable costs are reduced. Variable costs include men's salaries, food on board, living conditions, and the like. The Fiji government encourages the distant water fishing nations or foreign fishing vessels because they buy supplies here, pay wharf and other fees, and unload their catches. Both groups of companies need deck crew. While most bring in crew from Asia, they supplement them with 3 or 4 ETOK men because they are stronger, and the Pacific Foreign Fisheries Ministries say that Pacific Islands must be a crew on a fishing vessel. The thing about industrial fishing is that it takes place out of sight. Only the crew know what goes on those vessels. A logbook and logbooks are unfaithful to recording it all. Situations on the margin of trafficking are common in the tuna fishery, and labor exploitation is rife. In all of the reports she has read and the crewmen's tales she has listened to, clear human trafficking is missing, but there is deception in the act of recruitment, which results in men being forced to work contrary to verbal or written agreed conditions. There is also fraud, general dishonesty, and providing false or misleading information.
Wilson, can I just, while the statement is very interesting, we're quickly running out of time. So if you could wrap up in the next 2 minutes so that we can still have a few questions, maybe perhaps specifically on the fishing industry as well. Thank you.
So why is this? The main culprit is the economic constraints of the fishery. Clear profits are heard to come by. So I'll go to testimonies that we have heard that she has captured on a field work. I'll read the four stories. The men sign contracts but are not given copies. It is standard practice that each month when he is at sea, his wife or a mother goes to the company or agent to collect a portion of the month's salary so she can care for the family and pay bills. But because she doesn't have a copy of the contract, she doesn't know how much she should be given, because when the man signed the contract, the man himself was not given a copy of the contract. Example 2, Kiviniemi and Charlie were crewing on the UE number 6 in Solomon Island waters when the vessel was being pounded by a cyclone. In the night, a freak wave washed the two of them overboard. Looking back at the vessel as they struggled to keep afloat and alive, they saw that the captain had the remaining crew rescuing the gear and the goods that had also gone overboard. After doing so, then they threw the life jackets to their 2 men. Example number 3, 21 years ago, Josiah Dama was a strong young man from Fulanga Island, but on a Korean vessel when moored at a wharf in Japan. His fingers became frostbitten when he was made to unload tuna from the 30-degree freeze. Eventually, his fingers became gangrenous and they were amputated. When he inquired about insurance, he was told that, yes, the company insures its crew, but only when they are at sea, and because his fingers were amputated on land, he couldn't get any. Josiah and the family live in abject poverty in Waikanake. The last one, Merendani is a Kalekano woman with 4 children. 12 years ago, her husband, Joeli, was murdered by the cook on a fishing vessel. In telling about it last year, she concluded by turning and saying, "Ma'am, I don't know whether they arrested the cook and if he went to jail." Later, I did some Googling and also visited the High Court Registry and the Correction Service. There were newspaper reports, a sentence of 12 years, and the cook was still in prison on Taveuni with 1 year left to serve. When I gave her the newspaper cuttings and etc., Merendani was delighted. It was closure. But on one from the court, prosecutors or defense or journalists had bothered to tell her she was just a woman in that settlement, Kalakana, where no one goes. But the industry relies on Kalakana for its crew, strong men and hard work. Thank you. I'll end it there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vilsoni, and giving us some of those very tangible, practical issues that are faced in the fishing industry. And reminder that even if some of these issues are local, we're all competing in a global market, and so we need global recognition of these fundamental human rights and enforcement of labor rights, because without that, it's very hard to create this playing field that allows businesses to thrive and exploitation to be eradicated from the labor supply chains. On that note, I'm going to take one question that I've seen come up in the chat box, and then if we still have time, depending on what the organizers say, we're going to move to taking questions from the floor. But this question is specifically on the usage of flags of convenience and the fact that there are Pacific Island states who allow the usage of their flags, but there's very limited labor enforcement on those vessels, and there is exploitation and trafficking found on the ships. And how can that be? What is the enforcement that can be brought about there? Maybe also a little bit touching on the ships, and this was an issue mentioned, I believe, earlier by one of the panelists as well, that there are fishing vessels on the high seas, and how can those be regulated when they do not come within territorial waters? I mean, this is also a space where IOM is working together with ILO and the Pacific Forum Fisheries Agency to really try to strengthen the capacity to see how to identify potential trafficking and modern slavery on fishing vessels. But would be great to hear a bit from the panelists on what can we do around the usage of flags of convenience.
Peppi,
Lisa, would you? Yeah.
Yeah.
Would you start?
Yeah. Look, I understand that this is a really important area, and there's been quite a lot of activity recently, particularly with Greenpeace, USA, working with, I think Walk Free have been involved in this in relation to flags of convenience in the waters around Taiwan. But I think also there's been some activity in terms of New Zealand in a legislative way to do with flags of convenience. I haven't got, unfortunately, the details of that New Zealand legislation with me right now, but I know that New Zealand have really looked into this as an important issue, as a way of addressing forced labour on those vessels. So I think if I can find more research, I'll share it while other panelists might want to respond. But I think that there is a way to address this through a legislative instrument for sure.
If I can add a few words. Fishing vessels and just all the various ships in the Pacific are really, the working conditions, this type of ships and fishing vessels are very often very poor and very bad. And until latest time, very few work and very few projects or activities were undertaken in the Pacific. And as Peppi mentioned, we are now hoping to start very soon, early next year, to start the project on improving of working conditions on fishing vessels. And for the ILO, particularly, we are promoting the ratification of Convention 188 on working conditions on fishing vessels, which will help in case of ratification and proper implementation in national legislation and by national authorities, which will help to address all those issues which were raised in the comment of a colleague, because it is important first to have the national regulation and then to have a proper implementation through port state inspections, through various forms of inspections, through very good control. And the same situation is for other commercial vessels. A few countries in the region have ratified Maritime Labour Convention, and it helps to develop national legislation in compliance with requirements of this convention. So, for example, now in Fiji, we are discussing the draft maritime labor regulation, which will help to improve working conditions of those who work on various forms of commercial ships, various types of commercial ships. And yeah, well, national legislation, ratification probably of international instruments, development of national legislation, and then proper implementation of these instruments, that's what we should do. But of course, from the situation where we are now, it is very long way forward. And yeah, we really need to take joint efforts.
Would any of the other panelists still want to? I've been told that we have to wrap up after this question, so this is the opportunity still for the panelists to have a few words.
Thank you. One, probably a comment and then a question. The first comment is on the supporting the statement that was coming from Kailola, particularly on the fisheries, and it's good to hear that ILO is working on that particular area. Bianco, we are working in some of our countries on civic space and putting it as part of the partnership with Civicus on our civic space monitoring. And that has come out from Kiribati. So it's not just a Fiji issue, it's also a regional issue. Come out from Kiribati, where one of their citizens was being killed in a ship trip. And there's no answer whatsoever from the company or anyone from the sector. But that speaks to how our Pacifics are arranging in terms of some of the foreign fishing companies are registered under our flag. I don't fully understand how it works, but then when it comes to taking the whole accountability on modern slavery, we don't seem to know who is supposed to be doing the remedy, yeah, because they are kind of registered under a country in the Pacific, but the operations of the ship is somewhere else. So perhaps that's just like something put forward for ILO to look into that as well while you're preparing to work on that particular area. The other one may be because now we are talking about seabed mining, yeah, where we will be looking if our government is not listening to us, but they will continue to work on that. There might be some of our young people that will be so eager to find out what's going on in the deep sea. Perhaps there's an emerging issue for ILO to look into that. My last point is that on the seasonal working scheme, is that something that you guys are working on in terms of how it's related to modern slavery, particularly when some of our government are working a bilateral arrangement with some of our New Zealand, Australia, working with the direct businesses, and then we see that when it comes to when in the COVID-19, when they need to be coming home and all of that, and then they're looking for the regional processes to help in making that arrangement. Thank you.
Thank you for the intervention from the floor as well, and for those specific issues that you raised there. Unfortunately, we've exhausted the goodwill of the extra time that we had. And so I would just like to conclude by really thanking all the panelists for their interventions today. This is a topic that I could keep on talking on forever, and based on the questions that we didn't get to and the issues that we haven't yet touched upon, I think, you know, there is enough content here for several more discussions and panels. But thank you for panelists for being there, and for the audience for your participation, and hope we can continue this in the future. Thank you very much.